We've got a fantastic panel to lead the way. Mark Cutifani, CEO of Anglo, who has spent, I think, at least several decades now leading both companies and teams that I think, and the industry more broadly, in a very sort of thoughtful and courageous way to have new types of conversations and collaboration with stakeholders to really work out what does it genuinely mean for the mining company, the mining industry, to be a partner in development with host countries and communities. So great to have you with us, Mark. Henriette Kolb, a good friend and colleague from the International Finance Corporation. Henriette is the head of the Gender Secretariat at the IFC. The IFC has had over sort of 60 years now of being one of the pioneer examples, I see CDC here as well, of mobilizing sort of public sector resources to leverage and catalyze private investment and private operations. Henriette comes to the IFC with, I think, a very relevant and interesting background, not only a very strong commitment and a pioneer in women's economic empowerment, but also done fantastic work on the role of technology. We had a question earlier about how does technology empower women, and she's been one of the pioneers in that field, as well as being the UN representative of the Middle East Quartet and fascinating on-the-ground field experience with UN agencies and the German Development Fund. On my right here is Mark Goldring, who is the CEO of Oxfam GB and well known to, I think, many people in the room. And Mark, through his time at the Voluntary Services Organization, at the UN, at DFID, has also had several decades of being a passionate and well-known and respected sort of advocate for the poorest people in our communities. And it's really, really great to have you in your relatively new role at Oxfam GB, Mark. And then last, but certainly not least, Phil Thomson, who is the president of Global Affairs at GSK. And Phil has also, over the past several decades, through various corporate strategy roles and corporate affairs and corporate responsibility roles, worked with the GSK team to make GSK one of the pioneers within the healthcare sector in really sort of thinking through what is the role of pharmaceutical companies going beyond sort of traditional product donations to actually be thinking about R&D and pricing of drugs and vaccines, and going beyond that, how do you build the capability of health systems in developing countries? So we've got 4 panelists with fantastic experience and insights, and I'm sure some war wounds to show also for some of the experiences that they've gone through. And what I'd like to do is sort of start actually with our 2 business colleagues, and Mark, probably start with you. Could you just sort of get us going in terms of what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities and challenges for your company when it comes to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and both your company and the industry more broadly?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I guess in speaking for the mining industry, I always like to start with a bit of a promotional comment to highlight what we think the positives are, either through direct, indirect, and through the products that we produce. We believe we drive about 45% of the world's economic activity. I've always got to be careful in quoting that figure because the energy sector claims to drive 70% of the world's economic activity. So between the 2 of us, we really do believe we've got everything covered. But if I look to the real impact of what we do, we're a large industry, we're an important industry. Literally everything we're sitting on and in this room, if it's not grown, it's mined. The big issue for us is the people that bear the most significant impact of our activities are the people that we develop our operations close to. Now, if I ask the question here, who would like a mine in their backyard, I suspect I wouldn't get too many enthusiastic takers. What we'd like to think is by starting a conversation in a local community in a very different way, and that way is if we go to a community and we're looking to develop something, we should start with a question, and that question should be something like, what could we do as a partner to help you as a community achieve what you want to achieve in the next 20 to 30 years? Or what could we do to help you achieve a different future for your children, or a future that you'd like to see for your children. Historically, as engineers, we'd go to a community and we work through our Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and yes, you need clean water, you need this, you need that, here's what we've got, and by the way, you should be happy that we're here. And we're surprised that we used to get fairly negative reactions most of the time. What we found through our collaboration with a number of NGOs, faith-based groups, and a range of community players is that, believe it or not, communities have their own view about what's important to them. And if we as a mining industry could start listening to what's important, then maybe we could start with a different approach, because as mining companies, we bring capital that could be deployed to help establish infrastructure that would be valued by those communities. For example, can we turn subsistence agriculture into commercial agriculture through the provision of infrastructure that helps them get their products to market, provision of clean water, and a whole range of other activities, health services, things that we bring as a natural consequence of our developments. Can we focus those developments on things that support that community? And when we think of our operations in a 20 to 30 year time frame, the life of the resource, can we establish infrastructure that will live for 100 years and help those communities establish alternate commercial activities that create new futures for those communities? In some cases that's very real, in some cases it's not. But the key is to start a dialogue to understand how we can make a difference. I make one reference, and you know the story of Cardinal Turkson, who quoted the words to me, meaningful existence. When we were looking at how we might think differently about how we could connect with communities, one of the groups and one of the individuals we visited was Cardinal Turkson, who was then the head of peace and justice at the Vatican. And we were talking about connecting with local communities. And the Cardinal asked the question, he said, well, what do you want from this interaction? And I said, nothing more than to listen and to try and understand what we might be missing. And he said, well, let me start with two words: meaningful existence. Given where you've grown up, given your life experiences, you have your own view about meaningful existence as it relates to yourself. But think of someone in Ghana literally farming to look after the family, hunting, getting water from the local stream, doing whatever they're doing. For them, that's a meaningful existence. With a mine, you come in and say, okay, we're going to take all that away and we're going to move you over here, we're going to give you a great house and you've got electricity that you can't pay for, and a whole range of other facilities that are quite useless in that environment. Why don't you listen to what is meaningful or what is important to them, and maybe, just maybe, you might learn that their needs are quite different to what you think they should be. And maybe in that conversation, you'll find a different pathway in terms of how you can develop your operations consistent with what the community sees as being important. That's a starting point.
Fantastic. So I think a very, very strong reinforcement from a message I think that's been running throughout the day of this, courageous conversations, meaningful conversations where the listening part and understanding the dynamics of often sort of power dynamics sometimes with low-income communities where the big company comes in and tells rather than listens. And so I think it's great to hear a sort of a technology-based, engineering-based company saying it's these conversations are absolutely crucial. And before coming on to you, Phil, I'd just like to pick up on one thing though. In addition to the conversations, the stakeholder engagement, one thing engineers and mining companies are brilliant at is project development, project management, and incredible technological innovation. And I've been fascinated by your future smart vision of mining in the future. And there's the one thing of really deeply respecting people and the meaningful existence of people, and then on the environmental side, you're doing some very innovative thinking about that it's not just about managing the water within the operation, but catchment forums, etc. And could you say a little bit about your long-term vision for how you can apply both technology and conversations and forums around water management, climate, and some of the environmental challenges?
Yeah, I think in many of the locations in which we work, or would like to work, there are water-stressed environments. So we convened a working session, a research and innovation session, and the only rule we put on it is that it had to have less than 50% mining industry individuals. So we cast the net very broadly. What we're looking for is how do we create a waterless mine, that is a mine that can extract resources with zero net intake from the local water, and how might we help those local communities harvest water more effectively so that that water becomes more usable to the local community. Now, at the end of the day, you've got to weigh up the environmental considerations with agricultural considerations and the broader community needs, but how do we change that whole game? So for us, we think that's one of the critical elements, along with significant energy reduction. Good news is both things go together. And working with local communities, where we have in Peru, where we had all of our permits cancelled for 10 years. We sat with the community, 18 months facilitated by the local governor, 23 initiatives, in particular around water and supporting local industries and a whole range of other initiatives. We've now got the community demand we build the mine on the basis that our infrastructure that we put in place providing water all year round to the community is a significant enhancement, as they see it, not as we see it, but as they see it, to what they're trying to do, and therefore supporting of the mine development.
Then a good example, again, of a theme that's come up several times today of that initial fundamental responsibility and duty to respect human rights, ensure health and safety, but then look beyond that as well. How does one, as part of that, then actually help solve community challenges and problems in close collaboration with them? And Phil, it's a good sort of segue to you, and that you and your team and colleagues have thought this through very much from, as I was saying earlier, the healthcare sector, and looking at massive big global health problems and being very clear and focused on what you as a company can do and then what you can do more broadly. And so I'd be interested in your comments on biggest opportunities and some of the challenges that you're facing as they relate to the SDGs.
Sure. So hello everybody. It's always dangerous when you talk to a room full of experts and you sort of share your thoughts, so forgive me if you've already ahead of me. I was actually just reflecting just before we came on that just under 20 years ago, GSK, who I work for, so a big global healthcare company, as Jane says, we would not have been sat on a sofa next to the CEO of Oxfam, UK. And now we are. And that's real. I mean, we've come a long way. 20 years ago, I was a junior product manager, and I, along with many people inside the company, were reading these horrific headlines of what our company and others were doing in South Africa when we intelligently, as an industry, decided to sue the South African government to block AIDS. Drugs.
This guy was president as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it was technical, and there was all sorts of great arguments that were put forward by the industry to do it. But the reality was, it was just incredibly stupid for all sorts of reasons. And Oxfam wrote and produced a very seminal report. And in fact, the person that wrote that report is now an advisor to our company and sits actually on the Corporate Responsibility Committee, which I have responsibility for. And we have, over the last 12, 15 years, moved from that point where we were, frankly, GSK, there were placards being held up that said, global serial killer, right? And we've moved from there to, I think, into a very, very different place as a company. But it's taken an enormous amount of effort, hard work, real conversations, engagement with the likes of Oxfam, advice from the likes of Oxfam, and many others. And I had the great privilege of working very closely with Andrew Whitty, who was our leader for 10 years, who hopefully many of you have heard about. But it was under his leadership that a transformational change was put across the company around how do we get to be on offer more sustainability. And you asked, Jane, the challenges and the opportunities. I mean, the challenges are immense and never go away. And, we continually think of ourselves as being a bit on fire, right, as a company. And, never relax, never assume. And that is really important when you're thinking about the sustainability agenda. Now, for us, the real issue that we face is innovation. And this is both challenge and opportunity. So I can get very excited talking to you, not that I'm a scientist, but telling you about the advances in science, and you can see, so go back 20 years ago, where we were in terms of cancer treatment and where we are now there's a fundamental difference. In 20 years' time, we will have moved forward on things like Alzheimer's. So there are massive opportunities for us in the science space, and as a scientific company, that's what we really focus on. But the reality is, some of you may or may not know this, but basically something between 96 and 99% of what we work on fails. So when we look at clinical development, what we're putting in at the start of that process and what's coming out, as you can see, is enormously challenging. And people genuinely say it's easier to put a man on the moon than it is to develop a new drug. And that, at the core of what we do, trying to find drugs, trying to develop them, is fundamentally the challenge. Now, in this space, what then starts to become prevalent is that, of course, if we make a drug that is in the cancer space or respiratory, which we're very big in, or HIV, there is a need for that. And particularly in developed markets, we have an economic model which allows a pull-through. People will pay for drugs. It's challenging and it's changing and it's getting pricing in these markets is deteriorating, but ultimately there is a financial model that works. When I then switched gears to, I have responsibility for global health inside the organisation, and I think about our pipeline that we have, a very interesting drug now for tuberculosis. And we're also working on the world's first malaria vaccine. Two areas that need new medicines, new drugs. And yet, as we think about how we bring those drugs to market, the economic pull-through is not there. The malaria vaccine is for African countries. We've invested in Africa with our partners, with the Gates Foundation, with PATH, and we've established clinical centres. But the reality of then that vaccine becoming available to all the children and babies and infants that need it in Africa is a huge proposition that we're still working our way through. So our biggest challenge is also our biggest opportunity. It's around innovation. We can do some amazing things in this space, but ultimately, we can't do it alone. And certainly in the markets where, yes, if we service a model which only caters for, let's say, 1 billion people, and yet there's 7 billion, another 6 billion in those markets that need existing medicines or new medicines, we have to find ways to address that and create the right kind of mechanisms, the right kind of partnerships to do it. So that, at the core of our business, is really the challenge and the opportunity.
Great. And I hope we can sort of come back a little later and talk about a few of the partnerships. But just most immediately here, obviously one of the biggest challenges in a lot of science-based, research-based companies is intellectual property, and yet you are doing some amazing partnerships with some of your peers and competitors. And it'd be interesting if you could just sort of talk a little bit about, how you as an industry are working together.
I mean, we run. One of the examples is an open laboratory in Tres Cantos in Spain, where we essentially, everybody thought we were crazy because we basically said, we've got this laboratory in Spain. What we're going to do is, things like tuberculosis, malaria, those kinds of neglected diseases or big disease areas where there is not enough research going on. We're going to say, right, we will take all our assets, all our IP, and we will make that available. And we did that. And it was an interesting move because people immediately went to, well, what happens with your commercial products, as it were, and those other assets. Anyway, we made the decision, and within the first year, I think we got something like 30 scientists from around the world all descending on Tres Cantos to start sharing their IP and their expertise with our IP and our expertise. And I think we've now had that laboratory running for nearly 6 years. We've had, a good few hundred scientists now either participating directly in it or with it. Have we found a drug? No, because as I told you, it's immensely challenging. Are we sharing the knowledge? Yes, absolutely. And is that a stable proposition? Yes, because we've also just then replicated that laboratory because we're now looking at it for non-communicable diseases in Africa. So there is a model here where if you initially said, particularly in our industry, which one of the backbones is intellectual property, where there's no way you can open that up or share it. That's a myth in the sense of it's an old industry view. There are ways to create open architectures, even in the most challenging industries where IP is really at the crux of what you do.
Great. So again, a great example of challenging conventional wisdom and having the courage to do things differently. So great. Henriette, I'd like to come to you now, and both you and Mark, from your both intergovernmental, government and non-profit experience, where do you think sort of some of the big shifts have been in both the expectations of business, and then put a bit of challenge to us here? What could business leaders be doing more of or better? And including some of the leading companies. Why don't we start with you, Henriette?
Yeah, so just to set the background, the IFC, just by show of hands, who's heard of it, knows it? A couple of you. It's not the International Film Institute or Corporation, it is International Finance Corporation, and it's the private sector arm of the World Bank. And so we invest in about 2,000 companies around the world. And as Jane rightly said, we've been doing that for 60 years. So I could sit here and say, told you so, see, the private sector really matters. But in fact, I want to be very humble and actually share some of the learnings of those past 6 decades with you, and sort of describe a little bit as to how much more urgency there is now to crowd in the private sector to help us tackle the SDGs. One of the sense of urgencies is clearly around the magnitude of financing that is required. And so we've heard David this morning, there's various sort of ghost numbers circulating, but it is estimated that it's about 4 trillion that the SDGs need in investment. Some actually say, to your point, that that's only required for infrastructure alone, leave it around health and so on and so forth. So huge amounts of money. Having said that, if you look at the official development assistance, actually, and I'm sure you could all guess, it's absolutely small in comparison. It's only around 132 billion. So you can see a huge gap there. So if we don't crowd in commercial capital in tackling some of these things, we are pretty much doomed. Now, the good news is that I think multilateral organizations like ourselves, but many others, are actually looking quite seriously as to how can we get the complementarity right between private and public. And so for the very first time, as part of what we call the International Development Assistance negotiations at the World Bank Group, we have opened a private sector window that has a dedicated commitment of 2 billion over 3 years. That doesn't get us to the 4 trillion, but is certainly a step into the right direction. Another sort of lesson learned from our investments is that even though the financing gap is huge, capital alone is not sufficient. So give you a concrete example, and I speak a little bit more around gender equality because I think it's absolutely necessary. It's ridiculous. We're in the 21st century and 50% of the population are certainly not part of the full spectrum of private sector opportunities. So one example as to why financing alone is important but not good enough is IFC's invested now 1.5 billion in women-owned enterprises, SME loans. And the way it goes is we give a credit line to a financial intermediary that then onward lends to women-owned enterprises. And that's great because women face a 300 billion credit gap every year in emerging markets alone. So again, huge figure. So very proud of it. But once the credit line is dispersed, then the bank goes back to business as usual, which is not good enough. And so we complement our investments with advisory to the bank that helps the bank or any other financial institution, insurance companies, to better understand what is it that consumers want, men and women, rural and urban. What is it that my workers want? How can I constitute corporate effective leadership? What do my suppliers want? And so it's a holistic approach that helps shift business models altogether as opposed to just sticking in the capital. And only if we do that will we be able to create really meaningful change over time. So capital alone is not enough. Another lesson learned is that consumer pressure has obviously increased a lot. And that's both in emerging markets as well as in developed markets. And clearly, probably most of you in this room might remember, I live in Washington, and so it was very public, travel ban, huge protests in November, and within 2 days, 500,000 users deleted the Uber app. Why? Because Uber surcharged customers during the travel ban protests. And so consumers took a very strong stand and said, we are not tolerating that. And they switched over to Lyft. Now, 6 months later, Uber has actually looked at what can we do better in terms of looking at treating our drivers in a different manner. 3 things have changed. You can now tip Uber drivers, and you weren't able to do that. Drivers have a shorter waiting period of time, so until they can start charging. And you actually can leave different rates of reviews to the drivers. So you see business models are shifting. The second example as to how business models are shifting and how we get more pressure is from institutional investors. Institutional investors and other investors are saying, complete lack of diversity on your board, not good enough. And the good thing is that now that pension funds are moving into that trend, actually you can exert a lot of not just compliance, but also excitement around developing a different value proposition that is financially based as well as having social returns. And just to give you one more figure, what's really quite staggering is the Global Impact Investing Network has 220 members. Now that responsible and sustainable investment has grown to 77 billion. So we see also in the US in particularly, there's a huge ramp up in terms of investors asking for not just financial, but also social returns. Now let me finish up by sort of 2 thoughts that are in my head. One is, we've proven that it is good business to close gaps between men and women, to address climate change and so on and so forth. We've got more pressure from stakeholders, shareholders, consumers, investors. Why haven't we done more? I mean, why are we still sort of like at this point? So there are still huge market failures. And in particular, what does that mean for all of us in a world where we might not need a vaccine because we can gene edit with CRISPR, or where we might actually have complete automatization in some of the industries? What do partnerships mean in these kind of shifting business trends? And also, why haven't we cracked some of the market failures? I have a couple of answers in the next round, but I would like to leave it hanging so you can kind of start thinking with us.
Yeah. and the double-edged sword of digitization,
Yes.
that, you know, what's the impact on jobs long term? No, well, thank you, Henriette. And I think even on the financing side, or the institutional investors, I mentioned earlier today how Swiss Re has just made this announcement of $130 billion that is going to be aligned with ESG investment. Yeah. But then the pressure on the short-term performance doesn't go away either. Yeah, exactly. And the activist investors are still knocking on a lot of corporate doors. So there's, from a business leader's perspective, it's a challenging time reading the signals. But Mark, your challenge, I mean, what are the big expectations? And from Oxfam's perspective, what and your personal perspective, what could business be doing more of and better to really drive this agenda?
The way business invests, behaves, will make a fundamental difference to which of the SDGs we hit, how quickly we hit them. There's no question of that whatsoever. And that can be an amazingly positive contribution. To us, the fundamental issue that will make a difference to how far we get is not additional schemes run by business, but the way businesses do their core business. Responsible business for 2017 to 2030 means looking at what is that impact on the community in the way that Mark and Phil have been describing. It's most obvious on the environmental front and climate. We've got clear standards, and I'm not going to dwell on that. I want to touch on 3 other areas that I think will make a fundamental difference, where every operation should look inside itself. And given that our hosts are Business Fights Poverty, let's start with that one of incomes and wages. The most obvious is our commitment, certainly as British-based organisations, to look at slavery. And when Oxfam looked at our own footprint as a major employer, we could not assure the world that there was no slavery in our supply chain. We could assure the world that we'd looked hard, we hadn't found any, but how far back do we look? Now, slavery is a horrific thing, but it's the tip of the iceberg. Behind that, you've got unreasonable, unsurvivable wage levels and conditions. So how we as businesses look right back through our supply chain to our employees, the smallholders that we buy from, the people that are employed right the way back, is first and foremost a fundamental responsibility that will have a massive impact on eradicating poverty. The second issue is gender. Unless we look differently at gender, we will not eradicate poverty, and we certainly won't eradicate injustice. As we work with many forward-looking companies, and they look at how they work, most aren't even thinking about the extra burden that women are facing on unpaid care. It's just taken for granted that before the woman comes to the work that day, she's done 3 hours work in her home. And if we look at that, we'll start finding different ways of thinking. We'll start recognizing that women don't take advantage of the training. They've got too many constraints. They don't get promotion. They don't get the higher wages. And also, as companies try and do the right thing by being equal ops employers, lots of the things that they do will backfire. You move from a casual workforce to a fully formalized workforce, and we've seen a company that means to do absolutely the right thing drive the women out of that supply chain. It was trying to do the right thing. So looking at gender differently has got to be a crucial factor. And the third that I'd really highlight is transparency, accountability, and engagement. Mark highlighted that from a perspective of a local community. We also need to look at it at national levels. One of the most crucial partnerships between companies and governments to eradicate poverty is around the payment of tax. And as profits are being moved around the world, tax is not being paid where that income is being generated. And Oxfam will publish a report later this week highlighting that major responsible, serious companies are doing this as a matter of course, and the impact of that on the ability of governments in poor countries to pay for those public services that its people need, the health and the education services, the basic agriculture, are being undermined. So the tax agenda is crucially important too. So 3 that I'd really highlight: work and wages, gender, tax and transparency are crucial to hitting the SDGs. And then I move briefly to look at what partnerships are fundamental to that. Well, I've talked about one with government, but it's really difficult for leading companies to get all this right on their own, on your own. You put your head above the parapet, and are you going to be challenged because you're actually talking about poverty? Or are you going to be challenged because you're actually saying, no, we're not paying tax here, but nor is any other company? So the ability for companies to try and work together, we have seen be successful. We've seen companies work together in the garments industry in Cambodia in a way that gave the government confidence to move from a minimum wage to more of a living wage, and know that it was not going to mean those companies walking away. We've seen companies producing tea in Malawi work together on broader issues, and those working on cocoa in West Africa. So those kinds of corporate partnerships can be invaluable. And then there are partnerships with civil society. Oxfam is proud of the fact that when we see something wrong, we try and call it. But we're equally proud of the fact that when companies are trying to do something right, we want to work with them. And the examples I've been using of things going wrong are more often coming from companies who are trying to do the right thing. We identify it together, work on it constructively. So that room for partnerships with government, The kind of investment in the underfunded drugs for which there might not be an immediate commercial market is a wonderful example. The relationship between companies, looking at what is the best practice that the mining industry can promote together or the garments industry can promote together. We're seeing in the best instances a race to the top. And the partnership with civil society, the local organisations that are representing the people whose water might be being diverted in a cotton plantation, right through to the international NGOs who can actually help work on the public so that we change norms, expectations, and where appropriate, legislation.
No, thank you. And I think that question of changing social norms, I think, is particularly challenging, but great opportunity. Are there sort of examples where you think companies could use their brands more? I mean, we heard a great one today from Diageo, but and marketing budgets, the sort of consumer-facing companies to try and challenge some of these embedded social norms.
Well, I think the first thing to do is we have to, together, keep working to tell the stories of the reality and trying to do the right thing. And I think companies that are brave enough to say we are working on this get a lot more positive publicity than negative. But that's pretty tough if you're a chief executive sitting in front of your board. Yeah. Because, of course, your board are not judging you on that. They're judging you on your immediate returns, and we can hear more about that. Yeah.
I mean, would you want to respond to that? I'm not sure I would necessarily, I mean, totally agree with that, but both of you, in terms of how are your boards beginning to support the agenda around sustainability?
Well, I think in our case, the board is very supportive of the case for sustainability, but I think the key thing is not letting it stay as a word, but helping people understand what does it actually mean on the ground. And I use a simple example. In my previous company, Anglo Gold Ashanti, we had a power station that was run by the government in the local community in Guinea. And there was, our proposal was that the local community had come to us, and the power station was only operating 50% of the time because they didn't have the skills to maintain it. So we offered to put an engineer and some support staff to get the unit operating above 90%. A couple of questions were asked at the board. Is that a good use of resources? And we had probably about a half-hour debate, and I made a very simple point. We are part of the community. Look at the work, we call it the Development Partner Framework, which we actually developed with Oxfam as part of our collaboration, that we're a member of the community, we're a good neighbour, our neighbours have a problem, let's help them. And we put someone in the power station. We said what we would also do is train the government workforce to see if we get them to take as much as they could in terms of responsibility and operating. So we don't want to take over the role of government. That worked. About 6 months later, there was an armed coup in Guinea. 5 people turned up at the mine gate with AK-47s and said, we want to go in and check because we believe you're stealing the gold from our country. In the next 24 hours, there was quite an active debate with the local community, who then ended up standing between ourselves and these guys and said, stop. They're running the local power station. They're the only place where we can get emergency health services for pregnant women and a whole range of other things. If you're going to annoy someone, go and annoy someone else. Now, that's not a good outcome for broader members of the community. But at that moment, I went back to the board and said, sustainability is more than nice words. It is what you do in that local community to make a difference, because whatever you do to do the right thing, you will see it come back in terms of the way that the organisation is able to operate. That's what real sustainability is about, is being part of the community, being supported when it most matters.
And how it aligns to corporate strategy and risk management and value creation for you and the shareholders. And I'm assuming it's sort of similar on your side, Phil, because I think both of you now are part of the sort of the almost sort of 30% of companies now that have board committees focused on sustainability, which didn't exist 10 years ago.
No, exactly right.
20 years ago.
We didn't have a board 10 years ago. And My reflection, having worked with the board now, I mean, I've had the privilege of working with now 4 different CEOs in different ways. And first of all, it is just a really hard job, right? And I think particularly for a CEO now, the idea that, you know, a CEO can lead a company and be wholly profit-centric is impossible because the world has obviously moved on and it's just that dynamic is gone. Having said that, I think there is still, if we're being honest and real, there is still you know, within the boardrooms, whilst there is a lot of change happening and, you know, the corporate responsibility board is definitely more influential than it's ever been, I'm talking generally here, I think, you know, it's harmonising with audit and risk, just as exactly as you say. There is still, I think we're still, you know, on a journey and a tipping point that for when, and this is particularly the case, I think, when you've got companies who have got, you know, underperformance, trying to find growth in a low growth world, who are under pressure, for them it becomes very difficult not to become totally focused around, well, what is the profit, what is the short-term return, what is it that we are going to generate to create value for our shareholders. And that mindset is absolutely right. That's what capitalism is, it's what business is. But when you're under pressure, I think it becomes, you know, there is still a risk, particularly if sustainability isn't, as Mark says, embedded inside the company's organisations. And I genuinely think that, you know, again, at the board level, there is a lot of change happening, but there's still another evolution that's required, which will happen, you know, over the next decade, over the next 2 decades, where, you know, board members of certain generations will become board members, and, you know, that view and that outlook will be part of the kind of board's thinking. So it's a journey. We're a long way ahead of where we were, obviously, 10 or 20 years ago, but I still think there's another evolution to go on this.
Another show that we see. Then, Henriette, I know you wanted to respond to something on the gender side, and then please sort of start getting questions ready. I want to, in about sort of 5 minutes, open up to some Q&A before we finish off. But do you want to pick up on the gender, and then you wanted to respond?
Actually, I'm totally flipping my roles. He speaks on gender, and I'm not. But no,
Which
I
is
actually
good.
wanted to push a little bit and actually follow on what you just said, Phil, which is what type of leadership do we need? And I would kind of push it further, because in a society, and I think that's happened in the UK, it happened in America, where you have much more polarizations in terms of against climate change action, for climate change action, against immigration, for immigration. And so you see this incredible divide. Company leaders have to have rational compassion with their workers. How do you talk to someone after Grenfell or after London Bridge or after whatever other calamity is happening? It requires a different way of engagement, because people have many more fears in developed and in emerging countries, and I think these fears are driving people to take extreme positions. So I think in terms of an incredible sort of fear-driven culture, business leaders need to be, and that does not need to be only the CEO, but really goes across, need to display different sense of values, courage of convictions, you mentioned that this morning, but really at the forefront seeing the person as a person. Yeah. Before you instrumentalize as consumers or shareholders and so on and so forth, because otherwise I think we again will not be able to tackle these clearly very huge market failures if we don't come together more for a form of dialogue that has gone lost and missing. So I just wanted to add that. Absolutely, and then I come to some of the examples on stakeholder collaboration where we can create that type of dialogue, hopefully in the question and answers.
Great. No, thank you, Henriette. And I think it goes back to Mark's point about, you know, respecting people. What does meaningful existence mean? So that deep personal respect, as well as doing more public advocacy.
We make a very simple point. People who talk about people as being our most important resources, I think have got it wrong.
Yeah.
People are
absolutely
not resources.
Yeah. Or
people
assets.
are the company. They're the heart and soul. Yeah. They are the company. They're not resources. And when you get that right, that changes every conversation in and outside the organisation.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you on that. Yeah, no, thank you, Mark. Mark, back to you, and then if you want to just make a comment on what others have said, and then can each of you, before we open up to Q&A, just share sort of one example of one of the sort of system-level collaborations where you're having a sort of system impact that you're most excited about and challenged by, and then we will open up to Q&A before finishing off. Mark.
Two reflections building on what I've heard. The first is, I think that whereas a good few years back we would see passionate people in corporate responsibility departments, we now see many passionate CEOs. But we don't see many boards that are measuring them financially in terms of pay based on those sustainability agendas. And we don't see many non-execs being appointed to boards to reinforce, to balance the other skills on the board. So that's one dimension where I think we can drive for progress. And then the other is that maybe one of the developments of the next decade or so is just thinking rather harder about who owns the companies. So it's different from adjusting the agenda to who's actually sitting around the table helping shape the agenda. And where we're seeing different approaches to shared ownership, we even had brave statements in the UK a year ago about workers on boards, where we're seeing trusts, foundations, family ownership. We're actually getting a different level of pressure and dynamism, where you can have a force that's pushing something rather than a set of forces where the CEO is negotiating with their board. Can we actually make this work?
Absolutely, and I know that tomorrow there's going to be a session or several sessions on employee share ownership, which is another interesting trend. So from each of you, before we open up to Q&A, one of the most both exciting, challenging, multidimensional sort of examples of collaboration. Phil, we'll start with you.
Okay. So the one I'd probably pick is, and this was right in the core of Andrew Whitty's thinking, was 2008, I think it was. We decided that that we would take 20% of the profits that we make in least developed countries, and we would essentially reinvest them back in the countries. And so a brilliantly sustainable way of generating infrastructure development and capabilities in those countries. And what we did was actually we took the investment, the 20% profit was reinvested through and was deliberately targeted to healthcare workers. But of course, we came up with the idea, we started to think about, okay, well, how does this do? But the implementation of it was absolutely impossible. I mean, we obviously could not do that. And of course, there is, as ever, there is a piece around what was the self-interest here and, where was the money going, how was the money being used. So we have 3 partners that we work with, Amref Care and Save the Children, and we work through them to build that capability development, that infrastructure, so they work as our deployment partners on the ground. And from that, we've now trained thousands and thousands of healthcare workers, but we've also branched off into all sorts of other interesting areas. So, for example, funding academic seats in some of these countries where university infrastructure is obviously limited, but there is university infrastructure and stuff that we can do. So that is an interesting model for us, and we're making more profit now in those markets, and that profit's being recycled through what we call our 20% reinvestment scheme.
Great, fantastic example. There's a whole question of building local capability and local capacity that, as Mark was saying earlier, gets sustained long after the company's project or even investment has gone, is a great example. Henriette, can you give us one?
All right.
And then get the mics ready, everyone. Sorry.
You traveled back in time. I'm just picking the most recent one, which was announced on Saturday. The G20, as you have seen, probably announced a new initiative called Women Entrepreneurship Finance Initiative, WeFi, not Wi-Fi, but very close. And what it hopes to do is to tackle that credit gap of SME financing that's missing for women-owned enterprises. And so talking about private, public, and actually NGOs, so the commitment of 13 countries that's gone out is 325 million will be raised. That would be used for enabling market development, de-risking capital, blended finance, and other instruments. And then the commitment is that we crowd in over $1 billion in investments from the private sector. So again, like really trying to enlarge the scope of the investment. The initiative is for 5 years. Now is a good time to partner with us. So if anyone in the room, company or NGO is interested in that, we will be working with a broad range of stakeholders to address sort of 3 pillars. One is evidence and data. We talked about it this morning. There's still tons of data missing. The Global Banking Alliance for Women is trying to get banks and other financial service industry providers to sex disaggregate data. The second pillar is to actually provide capital. And then the third one is to do sponsorships, mentoring program, and access to technology. So I miss to say everyone's raving about digital financial services. And yes, it's wonderful, and it does connect the unbanked into banking. Having said that, there's still globally a 9% gap between men and women owning and using mobile phones, but actually in South Asia, that's 38%. So still a huge gap in terms of physical asset ownership. And so we want to drive both, obviously, asset ownership, but also usage. So that's WeFi in a nutshell. I'm hoping it'll be hugely successful. It's building off IFC's work that we've done over the past 4 years with Goldman Sachs, which was called the Women Entrepreneurship Opportunity Facility. So we've demonstrated it works. We've committed over 600 million as part of that. But this one is taking this to scale, but also really introducing much more innovative startup capital, equity, financing, as well as insurance products, so to broadening the scale of financial services that women want and need.
Fantastic. So go to her if you're doing any work on women's economic empowerment. Thank you, Henriette. Mark.
2012, we put a challenge to the mining industry to think differently about the way we worked with our most critical observers. And in that conversation, we made a statement that invariably we learn more from our most critical observers than we do from each other in the industry. And so we started some collaboration with Oxfam. It was right in the middle of that conversation. UN Habitat, a number of faith-based groups, where we defined what we call the Development Partner Framework, which was really the formalisation of a way of working with communities in developing new approaches in the mining industry. As a consequence of that work, we've now got to a point where, with a number of those collaborators, we've agreed that we need to create a new space, a creative space, a safe space, where the mining industry can come together with NGOs, not based on a sponsorship for the mining industry where we're driving a particular agenda, where we sit as partners with different views, looking to find a space where we can both land and use that as the basis of a new dialogue for the future of our industry. So we think the institutions have to be remade on a global basis. That's our contribution. It's called the Development Partner Institute, and it was announced about a month ago.
Fantastic. So another great new example of real collaboration at a system level. So thank you. And the other Mark, and then we'll take some questions and then finish off. Yep.
Open it up, Jane. My colleagues have been heavily engaged today, and I'll just enjoy both Mark and Phil's examples.
Good. Okay, so questions. So we've got one lady there in the middle, one gentleman there, two gentlemen there. Great. So why don't we take those 3 questions? I'm not sure where the microphones are. You might need to...
I can shout.
Can you shout?
Yes.
Introduce yourself and shout. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marini from CARE. Thank you very much for a good presentation. My question was around the future. So it's 2-pronged, but I'll be short. First one is on, so every time we talk about policy, you mentioned, Mark mentioned the tax regimes. I wanted to ask a question about the elephant in the room, and that's thinking of 21st century economics, global commodity prices, and how they are determined by an invisible hand, and how that is going to change. And second was about youth. I haven't heard that, but Africa is going to have a huge youth bulge, and all the conversations are around smallholder farmers, youth and micro-enterprise. But what about youth who are taking the decisions? So I know IFC, for example, as part of the World Bank, does a recruitment for people from Sub-Saharan Africa. CDC has the Africa list, but what commitments are other companies making?
Great. No, thank you. 2 very, very important questions. John first, and then the gentleman in front of you. Yep.
So I'm John Hoffmeyer. I've both teach here at Oxford. I'm the director also at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Center on Business and Poverty. Our students love impact investment. They want to work in that field. Henriette's right. The Global Impact Investment Network cites $100 billion of impact investment each year. I want to ask both Mark and Phil to say how much their firms invest in R&D and all spending on mines. And I'd like them to say whether those are impact investments. And finally, wouldn't you like to have some of our students join you to make impact?
Okay. So.
This morning I asked about measuring the value of society from women. Last year at the Climate Change Conference in Marrakesh, the UN Women and a group of other amazing women were in a panel, and they launched something called the W Plus Women Standard. So instead of paying for carbon credits, we pay for women credits. So every company that minimizes the time where women spend collecting firewood or water and maximizes the time a woman spends with her family, cooking in a healthy way, gets a woman credit. So you can't touch carbon credit, or you can see a woman's performance. So that's in a voluntary sector, but I wish there's a mandate where every country in the context of the MDGs, through impact investments, how you can measure the true impact we bring to women in the communities. Yeah. I don't know if you're doing that. Thank you.
Good. Great. Well, three, I think, good questions to get us going. So if you want to just pick one or all of them, Phil, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So maybe just talk about R&D. So forgive me, when you say impact investment, what does that actually mean?
Therein lies the question.
So it's not a defined term in your mind? Okay, fine. So we spend £3 billion on R&D a year. So obviously quite a lot of money. We spend about £1 billion here in the UK, actually. We're one of the biggest in the UK. So, as I said to you earlier, we spend a lot of money and 99% of it doesn't work. So I don't know whether that's impact or not. Maybe not. But that's the scale of what we're talking about is in the billions of pounds. And what we then obviously have to do is allocate that capital across the different therapy areas we're in. We've just been doing some interesting work looking at actually how much are we spending in the global health space, and it depends on how you cut it. But we have probably around about 5% dedicated to global health right now. That increases astronomically when you then add in our HIV research base. And we think about R&D as in, obviously, as I said to you right at the very beginning, that innovation is at the core of the company, and we are constantly looking to get a better return on that R&D. Now, all joking aside, if we move our attrition rate by 2%, that obviously has a very significant impact. So that's how we think about it. I mean, that's the scale we're spending on. Obviously, if you've got some brilliant scientists and somebody that wants to work for GSK, we can talk afterwards.
Great. Sticking to the impact investing question first, any other views on?
Yeah. I want to make the link between the impact investing and gender. Because Oxfam's part of a small group who run a small impact investment fund. And we run it not because we can match the volumes that most other people can do, but because it's an amazing lab to see how you can actually make business work most effectively for most marginalized people. So in the issues we look at in measuring the impact, as well as the most obvious ones, the gender breakdown of the jobs created, the level of wages paid, and the rise of women within the company are part of those measures. Now that's quite demanding, because if you're a small investor, any company that can avoid having to give you answers on all those things will, because it adds work and cost. But if you can find like-minded enterprises, you can actually make a particular contribution to the status and opportunities of women through impact investing. So you bring together the two different dimensions, and probably what we've all got to do for the future is find ways of doing that are realistic at scale. that are practical and affordable for a business that involves as many people as your companies do. But looking at that differential impact of work, type of work, terms and conditions on women and men, we think is fundamental. The other one I'd like to pick up, because I don't have an answer to it, but we're all really troubled by it, is the youth agenda. And it's as if development hasn't kept pace with the growth of young people coming into the workplace. And people don't believe that people are all going to go back home and work on their farms, but nor have we found meaningful ways of engaging. And probably the thing we need to do is to be a little more humble and engage in those kinds of issues that you were talking about, Mark, which is a type of dialogue, rather than think we've got the right answer. And as development agencies, we've actually proved better at doing that in rural areas than in urban areas. But young people aren't staying in those rural areas. So rethinking development from a point of view of engaging young people is certainly something we're working hard on, without pretending we've got an answer that we can generalize from or preach to others about.
Great. Mark, yeah.
I'll try and catch the 2 points on the innovation. Firstly, just a couple of numbers. The mining industry on a global basis, and my numbers are about 3 years old, but the mining industry has been spending traditionally about 2% of its revenue on innovation. The oil and gas sector spends about 10% of its revenues on innovation. In our case, we're probably about 3.5 to 4. We spend about 70% of our innovation on short-term benefits and improvements. 5 to 7 year type stuff, about 20 to 25%, about 5% on step change innovation. And I think there's probably more your comment about long-term high impact. In our case, we believe the mining industry has failed society in the last 30 to 40 years because it hasn't been spending enough money on step change innovation, and many of our technologies haven't changed for 100 years. And so our Future Smart program looks to allocate a larger slice of the pie to the step change type innovation we think's possible. In all likelihood, we won't see the benefits until well beyond my time, but we think in those commitments with our water, our energy and a whole range of other programs, we're setting a foundation for a very new industry, which ultimately I think gets back to how you address the cost of mining commodities. And I think there are some significant changes required, but it requires a different mindset. It also requires a collaboration between communities and governments to in fact encourage us to put aside more funds to that longer term innovation, because in the end that's the real key for us as an industry to better serve the needs of society in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely, and using public capital to catalyse private innovation that's going to have a public good, whether it's medicines or water or
use private capital in a smarter way, and maybe provide some support from an incentive point of view. We'll put the money up, but as long as we get some support in terms of policy setting frameworks and provides us a little bit of help, I think you'll get more and more investment in that context.
Yeah, great. Finally, we are almost out of time. So Henriette, just final sort of comments from you in response to the questions.
Measuring, right? So you were asking how do we measure, and so let me take it back to the SDGs. UN Women is measuring how well are we doing every year in closing gaps between men and women, and the World Bank Group is very engaged through the Women, Business and the Law report to actually help achieve that. There's also a new effort because ILO has redefined the definition of work to account for unpaid work. So we're looking at measuring time use quite substantially, and then intra-household poverty. So these are sort of the 3 dimensions. And then maybe just to your youth question, so what we're starting to do some work around is the sharing economy and seeing how do new business models allow for either an entrance on low skill but then lead to upskilled work, or is it sort of a tunnel that actually never gets you out of contracting? And so because oftentimes, obviously, we hype these sort of shared economy models either as completely evil or the solution and end all to be all. So we kind of look at what does the data actually tell us, and is it sort of mobilizing populations, in particular young people, up the skill ladder, or is it actually bottlenecking them into sort of low skill, low margin, no benefit kind of jobs? And there the answer is definitely differentiated. Sometimes we've looked at the ride-sharing economy in Kenya and South Africa. Their opportunities for young people and women are very different and look to be more positive than actually in France and the UK, and there's various reasons for that. But I invite the group here in this room. We have absolutely little understanding what these new business models are doing, so I think finding a lot more research and impact investments into those spaces, I think, is quite important. And then last but not least, watch this space. IFC is embarking on a new gender lens investing report in emerging markets, because no one knows, again, what it actually is. What does it mean? Pax Elevate in the US, Astia Capital, a couple of others have really sort of tried to define it for the US market, but in emerging markets, really the understanding is relatively limited, and so that's a new report that we're hoping to come out with in the fall.
Great. No, well, thank you, Henriette. And although we did start late, we are out of time. So I think just three closing comments from my side. Thinking of the title of our overall conference, Rethinking Collaboration, I think some of the key themes coming out for me is the incredible importance of courageous and thoughtful conversations. Secondly, core capabilities and competencies on whoever the partners are. What are the core capabilities and competencies, the technologies, the business models, the dialogue models that the NGOs can bring to the table, and how do we harness these core capabilities and competencies? And then thirdly, this idea of collective voice, collective action, I think is clearly rising, and your point, Mark, the sort of business-to-business collective action, as well as the multi-stakeholder collective action. But so thank you very much to the panel, and I'd like to now, before completely finishing, handing over to Zahid and Yvette, because I think at the end of the day, and we've got 4 great examples of it on the panel, and so many examples as I look out of the room, so much of this comes down to individual leadership and passion. And as Mark was saying, sort of the understanding meaning of existence, looking at the other, and deep respect for whoever the person is and the people are that one's engaging with. But you're taking that personal responsibility and leadership for making a difference. So thank you to our 4 leaders on the panel for giving us those insights, and I'll hand over to 2 remarkable leaders who have really challenged conventional wisdom and done things differently, Zahid and Yvette, or I don't know if Lena's going to hand over and introduce you. Yeah, good. But thank you very much to our panel.